Chapter 37. Malini. Across the ford, in a gleaming expanse of sunlight, stood Chandra's army. "They have more men than we thought," Prakash said in a grim voice. In the chariot beside her own, he stared out at the army with a set, determined look on his face. This must surely be the bulk of Chandra's forces. "But he isn't there," Malini said, answering Prakash's unasked question. "I can see no sign of his chariot, his banner." "He may not wish to be conspicuous," suggested Prakash. "Oh no, my brother always wishes to be noticed. If he were here, we would know. Clearly, he refuses to face me in open battle." She felt the decision in her own voice like a venom. How little he thinks of his own kin, and the men who stand against him. She watched the movement of distant flags, of their staffs white and gold, just like her own. Imperial versus imperial, but where her army was made up of Parijati and Shrungani and Dwarali, dressed conspicuously in their own colors with their own weaponry to hand, Chandra's forces were Parijati through and through. Why had he sent so many men? Did he truly have a large enough army to hold Harshingar without them? It wouldn't matter, of course, if these men defeated Malini's right here at the Very, where their superior numbers would decimate her own. "We hold here," she said. "We offer to negotiate. The longer they bided their time, the longer it would be before they would have to fight, the longer Rao and the Sakatan forces would have to cross the river and attack Chandra's forces from behind. She would lose plenty of men. She was aware that her strategy made that an inevitability. But keeping count of her own dead as low as possible was a worthy endeavor. "Of course," said Prakash. He opened his mouth to speak further. A sudden cry cut through the air, and then another. Next to her, Razia leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Empress," Razia said it sharply. She raised one hand, pointing. "Look." Malini tightened her hands on the edge of her war chariot's walls and turned her head. The Very was a curving river, but so flat that it was like a silver scar across the landscape. The curve of the river where Priya and the others were crossing was half hidden by the dips and swells of the landscape, well suited for an ambush that they hoped to carry out. But Malini still saw what came next. It was impossible to miss. Farther along the Very, in the direction Rao and Ashutosh's forces had traveled at the firelight of dawn, streaming black shadows were following in an arc across the river. They could have been birds. They moved gracefully enough. But they were not birds. They were arrows, a huge swath of them, released by archers in Chandra's service. Rao, thought Malini numbly. Priya. Oh, how much of a fool she'd been to allow two of the people most precious to her to fight without her, so she could not even witness their deaths. Had they entered the water? Were they crossing or being worn back? More arrows fell as she clenched her hands so tightly that she could feel the bite of the chariot's edge into her palms, the sweat rising up on her skin. She'd been such a fool. There were cries of jubilation from across the water and the sound of weapons being readied, armor jangling, elephants lowering as their reins were pulled to draw them forward. There would be no negotiation. Chandra's forces had known what Malini's gambit would be, or guessed it possibly, and they had prepared for it. They needed only to face her now on the ford, no enemy at their back, and the depleted enemy before them, and their numbers would eventually overwhelm her own. More arrows fell. The beat of hoofs as Khalil rolled over to her, flanked by two of his men. Blood in the water. One of the Dwarali managed, panting almost as hard as his horse. They couldn't get closer, but I saw soldiers in the water. Prakash released an oath. "Were all our forces in the river?" Malini asked, her voice hollow. I don't think so." Then he swallowed and blinked and said, "No, Empress. I don't know how many were out in the water. And safe. I couldn't see. But—" "You've done well," Khalil said roughly. "Go join the rest of the cavalry now. Prepare yourself." As the rider departed, Khalil turned his attention on Malini. "Well, Empress," he said, "we'll need a plan fast. How many men are you willing to lose here?" "We cannot retreat," Prakash said. They will chase us, Lord Khalil. We would die hunted like animals." If the Empress survives, there is always hope that battles will be won in the future, said Khalil. His eyes were fixed on Malini's own, reading her, judging her, but waiting for her response. Besides, my lord, Tuawali has the fastest horses. I'd be willing to take the risk. If you say the word, Razia said in a low voice, we will guide you to safety as swiftly as we can. Her own women on their horses and their gleaming armor were listening, waiting. There was no time to strategize or think the path ahead through carefully and logically, and yet Malini saw it all, saw it even as she stood in her chariot and heard conscious sound, and heard the noise of animals and dying men and the hiss and clang of weaponry, all of it the rich warning of an oncoming storm of war. The paths that lay before her, defeat, slow and inevitable if she ran, defeated, fast and fierce if she remained. Unless... She thought of Priya's strength, the steadiness and power of her. She touched her knuckles to the black flower bound by a chain to her throat, the black flower made from her own pain by Priya's hands. She breathed. We're showing a lack of trust, she said. There are still men alive at the village crossing, and they are going to make it across. They've been slaughtered, said Prakash. Trapped. Not all of them, she said, metal on her tongue, blood, terror. Whatever her body was trying to tell her, she couldn't allow herself to feel it. Lives have been lost, but there are plenty of soldiers still alive. When they cross, we will move, and crush Chandra's forces just as we planned. Even if they cross, and they cannot, their appearance will be no surprise, Empress. Prakash's voice was oddly subdued, his face grim. Without surprise, we cannot win. Your brother's forces know we're attempting to surround them. They will not leave themselves unprotected. My brother's forces know that they have rained arrows down on my shoulders, and that my soldiers are dead, or wounded, or trapped on the bank, Malini said. My brother's forces believe, as you do, that the rest of our warriors have left on the shore cannot cross, that the only strength I have is what is visible to them right now, the men that surround me. Your men. Let us use their belief against them and fight them with all our strength. Keep their focus on us, so they do not see the enemy they believe they have defeated coming at their backs until it is too late. Silence. Empress, Prakash said awkwardly, just as Khalil said bluntly, you're relying on an impossible hope. I know the worth and strength of my men. Prakash exhaled shakily. We would be choosing death. You have no swift Dorwali steeds, Lord Prakash, she replied bluntly, nor do my Parijati soldiers. I may live, and Lord Khalil's men may live, and his wife may yet live, and her women also. But there is no choice for you but death in a flight or death in a battle. If you will not trust me, then trust this at least, and make your choice. No time. But Chandra's soldiers hadn't yet crossed the ford, were preparing their archers as Malini's own arrayed themselves along the bank. The guardswomen were drawing shields, preparing to defend the chariot where Razia and Malini stood. So she had long enough to watch Prakash's expression crumble, then grow resolute, for his shoulders to straighten, and for him to say, I will trust in your choice then, Empress. General, she said in turn, inclined her head. And you, my Dorwali general? Khalil was silent, his eyes hooded, thoughtful. He looked not at Malini, but at the woman next to her. He gave a nod. Whatever had passed between them was enough. As you said, Empress, he said finally, I and my wife can flee, as can you, and your hope seems false. A quirk of his mouth, mirthless. As a man who has used this very gambit, I know you failed. Lord Khalil, she said, I have long considered you one of my strongest allies. You have come this far. You waited against all hope for Aditya to rise to his fate in Shungna. You have accompanied me every step of the way, as I have striven to meet my own, and my fate, my purpose, has not failed me yet. Will you be my ally here now too? Will you trust in my fate? I am no worshipper of the nameless to place my hands in prophecy, he said. But you are a worshipper of the mothers, and I am their hands, she replied. I have long thought, he said eventually, that loyal allies must receive loyal rewards. An empress fulfills all her debts, Lord Khalil, she replied, hoping the look on her face, the weight of her words, mirrored his own. But an empress must gain her throne in order to give her words the weight of action. I will hold you to that, empress. He tugged the reins of his mount, turned. I'll prepare the cavalry. We'll throw all our might at them, and see what comes of it. Apart from too many dead horses, he patted his own mount's neck. Survive, empress. I will, she promised with utter surety. She had no room for doubt. Either the miracle she'd asked Priya for would manifest, or Malini would soon be dead, and the dead had no capacity for regret anyway. Lord Prakash, Malini said when the orders had been given, neither of us are great warriors, fit for wielding weapons in battle, I think. He inclined his head in agreement. But I will be glad to stand beside you and shape this battle together, she went on. I will be honored to have your guidance as my elder, and to hear the wisdom my father once placed great trust in. Some of the wariness the flint her harsh words had brought out in him softened. She saw it in his eyes. And I will be honored to guide you. On one side of the fort stood Chandra's army, archers and riders, chariots gleaming and flags flying, all imperial white and gold. On Malini's side of the ford stood her foot soldiers, her archers higher up on the bank, poised and ready to fire, her Dwawali horsemen holding their mounts still, waiting for her orders. She raised a hand. A conch was sounded. Both sides moved forward like two clashing waves. Foot soldiers racing forward, Chandra's army outfitted with sabers, her own with maces and whips and daggers and swords, and then nothing but bodies crashing into one another, and arrows flying thick and dark from both sides of the water. Her Dwawali riders surged forward with a cry, white mounts racing into gleaming water, and Malini stood tall in her chariot, bearing witness. She breathed through the scent of blood and water, as the water's edge turned to a froth of unending mud under hundreds of feet and hooves. One thing was in her favor. Chandra's men clearly had less familiarity with the fighting styles of Shrungna or Dwawali. They were struck by maces, skulls abruptly reduced to meat, bones broken through their armor. Arrows caught them with brutal speed, Dwawali soldiers crouching on the backs of their steeds with their bows drawn for attack. As Khalil had told her, Dwawali horses were not used to warfare on water, no matter how shallow, but their riders were confident, holding them steady. They are not seasoned, Malini observed, watching her brother's Parijapan soldiers with a critical eye. They were clearly well trained. They fought fiercely, but there was an edge of cruelty and cleverness to a battle-hardened man, to her own men, that these did not have. Slowly, she began to realize that these men were reared and trained in the imperial city of Harshingar or surrounding Parijati estates. They should have been Harshingar's last line of defense, not the first. What are you doing, Chandra? Malini thought, frustration and dread warming through her. She could not understand his scheme, his intent, and then abruptly she stopped thinking of Chandra entirely. Malini felt the rattle of her chariot around her, gold and steel and gilded wood trembling. The horse reared uneasily, barely calmed by the charioteer's practiced hand. She steadied herself, widening her stance, and Razia grasped her shoulder tightly, remembering perhaps the chariot that fell when the first faced Chandra's fire outside High Prince's fort. Then together they looked to the distance, where the arrows had fallen. At first Malini saw nothing. And then the water was rising, not like a natural wave that Malini had ever seen, but like a wall, a shield. It was bright, huge, a shining mirror reflecting death. It fell with a roar, crashing onto the far bank, moving with terrible fury into the flank of Chandra's army. Too far. They were too far to see anything in perfect detail, but the explosive howl of the water was undeniable, and the sheer size of the wave, and the power with which it swept over the bank. It swept over people, dark shapes running, then abruptly swallowed them. Malini's mind could barely comprehend it. She was frozen. Her men around her were frozen. A noise split the air, almost inhuman, a wail of grief and horror from one of Chandra's men. All the men in the distance are dead. All those people, she thought, all of them, gone. If I had blinked, I would not even have seen them die. Joy bloomed out of horror, suddenly, fiercely. Priya, she thought. Priya, you did it. The wave settled. In its place, something grew out of the water, a bridge, fast and strong, a thread binding the two banks together. Only then did the water grow entirely calm. She watched for a moment as her Aloran and Sakatan forces crossed the bridge where there had been no bridge in sudden press of bodies, shouting in triumph. She wanted to yell with them, wanted to scream a kind of vicious triumph out, but she hadn't won yet. She turned her focus to Chandra's army. There was a kind of impossible, awful forward motion to an army in battle that could not be easily halted, only slowed. Chandra's men could not simply turn back and fight the enemies at their flank. Rao's men, the Sakatan soldiers. Chandra's men had faltered, were wavering, frightened by the strangeness of the water just as her own people had been frightened by the unnatural fire of Sakata. At the maze fort, fate had turned against her, but today it was in her favor, and it was all thanks to Priya's presence. All Malini needed to do was let the tide carry her. She raised her saber in the air and finally let out a cry bottled inside her, a thin, wild thing, like a bird of prey taking flight above the wounded hare. The sunlight caught the edges of her saber, giving the polished blade a hue like bright fire. For Parijatvipa, she yelled. For the mothers. For your empress. She heard the answering cries around her, a noise that swelled and swelled, already triumphant, drowning her enemy in its song.